Welcome back to another episode of Gnostic Chats, where we delve into the mysteries of the universe, ancient wisdom, and esoteric arts. I'm your host, James, or the Gnostic Chef, and today we're exploring the fascinating world of Spagyria, a branch of alchemy that focuses on spiritual medicine and preparation of plant-based remedies. For centuries, alchemists have sought to unlock the hidden potential within nature, distilling the essence of plants into powerful healing elixirs. But what exactly goes on in creating a spagyric remedy? How do the alchemical principles of salt, sulfur, and mercury play into it? And what is the significance to the stars and the planets hold to these mysteries? Well, follow me along today with my guest, Phoenix Aurelius, as we explore these topics and see where we can come to a conclusion. And with that said, enjoy the show. All right, welcome back to another Gnostic Chat. Today we brought in Phoenix from Alchemical podcast. He's a spagyricist, a sidereal astrology, and just needed to bring him on to share some of his beautiful knowledge around these topics. And with that, I'd like to see what we have. What is a spagyric?
Yeah, so a spagyric is technically a bit of a misnomer. Although the way that people use it today, you will hear that term, typically refers to like a spagyric tincture, which is an item of pharmacopoeia that is an offshoot of Paracelsian pharmacopoeia that was developed, as far as we can tell, probably sometime between the late 19th century and early 20th centuries, that follows alchemical cosmology since the time of Paracelsus and uses different types of methods to create an iatrochemical or pharmaceutically active type of herbal medicine. But technically, spagyria is used the same way that, say, the word pharmaceutical would be used. So to say that something is a spagyric would be like saying something is a pharmaceutical.
A pharmaceutical, right?
Yeah, there are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of different items of pharmacopoeia that can be made within the context of spagyria. And unbeknownst to a lot of people, spagyria is an entire system of medicine, complete with its own theories and cosmologies and diagnoses and other, obviously its own pharmacopoeia. So that is kind of a big part of my work, is trying to teach people more about spagyria as it actually exists as a historical art form, as opposed to the way that it's kind of been delineated by more modern alchemical authors over the last 100 or 150 years.
Yeah, it seems like we keep doing that with language, right? As we get further and further along, we keep just muddying up the water more than it needs to be. And I appreciate you clarifying the idea of changing the spagyric as pharmaceutical. It totally makes sense to me, and I'm all on board. The beauty in the spagyria is that it's all stuff that's come from Mother Earth here, and just amplified and exalted to its highest levels, right? What can you run by the idea, just like the concept of what makes this a spagyric tincture so valuable?
Sure, yeah. So any item of spagyric pharmacopoeia becomes valuable for a number of reasons. I think one of the things, because let me just start off by saying, because I can already hear voices, me reading the voices on YouTube comments or whatever else of people being like, everything comes from the earth. It's like this. It's like when you make pharmaceutical medicine, a lot of the things that they are making these days are synthesized molecules, which have a mirror image to the actual molecules, the way that they would display in nature, in natural plants, minerals, metals, etc. And so oftentimes when they're synthesizing an active constituent, they're making a mirror image of the molecular shape. And our bodies don't really know how to process that. So that's for one. The other thing is that they're taking chemicals that are left over from petroleum mining refuse, and they are using, let's say, like the magnesium from petroleum mining refuse to bind to the synthetic molecule in order to make it iatrochemically effective. When we do that, the body develops a lot of Side effects, because first of all, it does not know how to process that mirror image molecule. Even though it's like the exact same number of atoms and arranged in the exact same way that it shows up is exactly opposite. And like I said, a mirror image from the way it would show up in nature. And so the body doesn't know exactly how to process that. And that's responsible for a whole lot of the side effects. The other thing is that the minerals that they're getting from the petroleum industry are not the endogenous minerals that would be found inside of, say, a plant itself that are ideal to be reacted with those molecules. And so they're kind of creating, if you want to think of it like this, Franken medicines. It's like a Frankenstein
Mm.
type of thing where they're getting, this and this and this from all these different sources. One of the beautiful things, I guess, about Spagyria is realistically that we only get the minerals from a plant itself when we are reacting the active constituents from that plant. So everything is coming from the same source. It's all coming from one thing. The other thing that is really unique and beautiful to me and to a lot of others about Spagyria is that Spagyria is a philosophical system of medicine, which means that it is not worried about the chemicals. It's not worried about the phytoconstituents or the kind of chemical composition, because we're not focusing on that level. Spagyria was invented realistically in the 1500s and has its roots in the alchemical tradition, which extend far beyond that all the way back to ancient Egypt in the West, and possibly also to Sumeria and Mesopotamia before that. But that being said, all of those civilizations, including Paracelsus himself, who was around in the late 1400s and early 1500s, those were pre-scientific revolution. And so we did not have the terminology of different chemical constituents the way that we have today. And it's true that the alchemists actually found most of those chemical constituents, most of the solvents that we use, named most of the reagents, most of the minerals and metals and other things like that, because they were in strong use. But we philosophize about them in terms of what we call their tria prima, or in Italian, tria prima. And that basically means the first three. And the first three are the things that you can break everything into within alchemy. And we call those sulfur, mercury, and salt, which is not to say brimstone, metallic mercury, and sodium chloride. We are talking about philosophic essentials that serve as archetypes. So that which is sulfur is that which can be extracted from a plant, and that which contains its color and its essence. So when we talk about the vegetable kingdom, for instance, when we talk about essential oils, that is the higher soul or the volatile soul. The volatile sulfur is what we would even refer to that as,
Mm.
alchemical corpus of that plant. And any of the things that can be extracted, like when you pour water over herbs in order to make an infusion or a basic tea, all of the things that make the color of that tea are part of what we call the fixed sulfur of
Mm.
that plant. And both of the fixed sulfur and the volatile sulfur combine together in order to create the entire sulfurous expression of that plant, or what we would call the soul expression of that plant. All of the juices, all of the waters, all of the things that can ferment and turn either into an acid or turn into an alcohol are referred to as the mercury of the plant. And so when we ferment herbs and we get a ferment and then we distill that ferment in order to be able to get a spirit out of it, that's what we're talking about with mercury. Mercury and spirit are synonymous. And even today, you can go to the liquor store and buy distilled spirits. We still use that term. That's one of the holdovers from the entire alchemical corpus and the initial distilling of alcohols like ishkaba, which is the Irish name for whiskey, which literally means water of life, or aquavit, which means the exact same thing, aqua, water, vit, of life. So there's a lot of different types of spirits like that that still exist and still have those names that kind of show that this is a source of spiritual energy of the plant. And of course, when you ferment and distill a plant, you can tell a big difference between the taste of them. If you go and buy silver tequila and
Mm.
you go and buy, say, a vodka made from sugar versus one made from potato versus one made from barley,
Right.
and you taste all those spirits, they have a different signature to them, a different taste to them. And that's because through distillation alone, alcohol can only get to about 95% pure, which leaves up to 5% for the characteristics of the plant that come over inside of that ferment and stay inside of that alcohol and give it that determining characteristic.
Right.
Um, so there's that. And then, of course, the salt then would be all of the purified mineral corpus that is tied up inside of that plant. And typically, in order to access that, we have to incinerate and calcine the plant material and then be able to leach the minerals from it, either using something like an acetic acid solution, like a vinegar or something, or by using pure water. And it depends on what type of solvent you use to be able to extract those salts will largely depend on what types of minerals that you have afterwards. Like, for instance, if we use water, we oftentimes end up with just a pure potassium carbonate. If we use an acetic acid in there, ash content has calcium, it has potassium, it has magnesium, it has lots of different types of things. And those metals, because all of those are metals, are going to react with and they're all base, they're going to react with the acetic acid in a different way, and they're going to create calcium acetate, magnesium acetate, potassium acetate, etc. And then, like, for instance, vinegar is 95% water and 5% acetic acid, so that water will also end up pulling out a lot of potassium carbonate as well. So all of these different types of minerals that are essential to the plant that can only be pulled out of the ash are considered to be the corpus, or the body of that thing, the salt of that herb or of that mineral. And the same philosophy extends also into the animal realm and into the mineral and metallic kingdoms as well. It's just that there are kind of more specificities, I guess you could say, with each
Yeah.
different ingredient. It's not as cut and dry as it is in the vegetable.
Yeah. It's and then so you got these three parts now, and then the idea is the alchemical wedding, right? So then you add those three um constituents together to create the medicine.
Yeah, good point. Yeah, sorry for not actually elaborating on that
No, it's
part.
okay.
Yeah, so what we do is we extract all three of those individual essentials, and then we purify each of them so that they're as pure as they can possibly be, and there's no excess, and there's nothing else that we can get out of them. Then what we do is we put them all together, and depending on what proportions, on what solvents we use to actually to like pull them, or what methods we use to actually like extract them from their original source, and all these other things, the different proportion of sulfur, mercury, and salt, what types of sulfur, mercury, and salt, when we add them together, and what types of processes we might do with them once they're added together, that is really what ends up creating different items of spagyric pharmacopoeia. But every single one
Right.
of them are all made with some variation of sulfur and or mercury and or salt.
Do you think that this is like part of the reasoning for why you'll see others that will naysay based on the fact that they haven't really totally understood the philosophical end of it? They
Mhm.
don't totally understand like the, oh, it doesn't have to be this acid, I could use this acid, it's an acid, it should use it just the same. And do you think this is the problem, like they'll use little shortcuts or things that they didn't know, and then now their medicine doesn't work, and then they go on the internet and say Phoenix is full of crap and doesn't know what he's talking about? But do you think that's probably the problem, more or less? It's just like little shortcuts or just a lack of understanding?
There's a couple of things. First of all, yes, just to like answer that succinctly, yes, there are a lot of people in the modern age who conflate the practices of alchemy with the practices of chemistry.
Hmm.
And this is something that we need to be very wary of doing, because, for instance, when we make substances the way that they have traditionally been made, or make solvents the way that they've traditionally been made, they tend to have a much greater nuanced chemical composition than the isolated and synthesized chemicals that we have today. For instance, like when I make acetic acid, I'm not only working with acetic acid to a certain degree. I mean, for the most part, it's like 99.9% pure, but there's all these other little micro traces of certain aldehydes and other things that are in there. Whereas they specifically get those out when they're trying to sell USP grade or US pharmaceutical grade um, acetic acid, or chemical grade acids and reagents through chemical supply stores today. They try and make it as chemically pure as they can, But a
Mm,
lot of times it's little minute traces of the organic molecules that happen from all of the organic processes and doing things with more, shall we say, dare I say, even more primitive types of equipment than what
mm,
is used in a lot of chemical laboratories today that give us these nuanced chemical reagents that we have historically used inside of alchemy. For instance, like Paracelsus was always talking about spiritus vini. He always wrote that, and it was like a Latin term. So he would write in German, but then he would always talk about spiritus vini. This spirit of wine is literally what that translates to.
mm,
But it's not just distilled wine spirits. It's not like a purified brandy. It's actually a more complicated chemical that gets looked at very similar to diethyl ether today. In fact, the
mm,
majority of the composition is actually diethyl ether, but because of the way it was made and the way it was distilled, there are also a significant amount of water and a significant amount of ethanol in there as well. And when we have a little bit of water, when we have a little bit of ethanol, and when we have the majority of this diethyl ether in these natural organic proportions that exist as a result of the processes of making them, you get a different style of extraction than if you were just to go to the store and use diethyl ether, or God forbid, go and buy petroleum ether and use that. So there are definitely some subtleties there. The other thing that I want to talk about really quickly is that Spagyria is, as defined by Paracelsus, is a medicinal application of alchemy. And so alchemy has to be part of the background of the individual who is hoping to make spagyric medicines. And unfortunately, somewhere along the way, in the late 19th century, we start to see certain authors refer to Spagyria as the herbal alchemy, which was not true. Paracelsus used minerals and metals and animal materials and herbs and everything ubiquitously, and water. And there was no such thing as Spagyria as just herbal alchemy. That started
mm,
being taught by people who had been delineated from Paracelsian teachings for hundreds of years already, and came up with a way that they wanted to teach alchemy, where you start in the herbal kingdom. They called that Spagyria first, and that was kind of like a dumb delineation, in my opinion.
misnomer. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly, a big misnomer. But the other thing about that is that if you don't have an alchemical background, because alchemy and Spagyria, even though they utilize the exact same processes in the laboratory, which is part of the reason why you need to be an alchemist before a Spagyrist, you need to have a comfortability with these. But alchemy and Spagyria are differentiated in the tradition that I teach by the simple state that alchemy is a method of performing all of this work in order to open up nature so that you can become initiated into nature herself by nature herself, with the idea that by the time you make the philosopher's stone or the red stone, that you have been able to work your way
Mm,
through all of the different kingdoms and be able to show a certain mastery of the level of transformation and exaltation of nature, and have been able to find those corollaries psychologically and spiritually within yourself.
mm,
And it's a primarily a pathway of esoteric initiation. Alchemy is, whereas Spagyria is applying the lab work and the various practices that we've learned, but being able to make it on a larger scale so that we can use it for remedial purposes for people who are otherwise sick or infirm. So people who are like, hey, I tried to do this thing and it didn't work. Oftentimes, unless you have a background in alchemy, you would not understand that certain things wouldn't work unless you fixed the aspect of yourself that
mm,
corresponded to that process. Like, for instance, when we calcine, one of the things that we're doing is burning away the herb itself and reducing it down to the purest ash. And what that kind of corresponds to psychologically is being able to burn away all of our own justifications and self reasons for why we are the way that we are, especially for the aspects of ourselves that we don't particularly like or enjoy.
yeah.
Like, for instance, I have a susceptibility to depression because, anything that comes after that because statement is a
Mm,
justification. It's a belief system, a very self limiting one at that. And until or unless the person has been able to actually burn that away and move through that, their calcinations in the actual laboratory are not going to be very thorough either, because they actually lack that common quantum thread of calcination from a psychological level, and all of us are imposing our psychology and imprinting that on everything around us. And so
Mm,
there's definitely that component too. And so when people are like, oh, I can't ferment this thing or I can't distill this thing, to me that is an indication of where their psychological and or spiritual hangups are. And that is something that a skilled alchemist would be able to advise somebody on, and how to be able to rectify those things
right,
and move past those inner things so that they can perform the laboratory work to a greater
right.
degree.
It's like the phoenix, right? You're burning and coming out of the ash, a new thing. Like and like you're saying, if you had like some trouble in your life, you could either A, let it keep you in bed and keep you depressed or whatever, or B, drive you to do something greater and bigger. So yeah, it totally hits home for me. The medicine itself, how do you go about picking the plants that is there I'm just thinking like George Washington Carey with the zodiac and the cell salts of salvation. I'm
Yeah.
thinking how you go through, you find some ailment and you find the correct cell salt that would potentially help, and then you would go find this in a plant, do the spagyria, come out with the medicine, and then that medicine should be the one that'll actually further your health.
Yeah, so there are a lot of different ways of approaching this. And Paracelsus had kind of, I can't say he pioneered this because the idea had already been around for centuries, millennia even before him, but he definitely expounded upon the idea of the doctrine of signatures, which basically says that plants, in the way that they grow and show themselves, have characteristics that kind of tell you what they're good for. Like, for instance, if a plant has a lot of yellow juice, that seems to be a lot like yellow bile, and therefore it may have an action on the bile production of the liver, and possibly also interface with the gallbladder because bile is stored in the gallbladder, for instance. Um, so there are things like that, or that, for instance, rose, how it has five petals, and those five petals open up and look exactly like the shape that Venus makes in its continual
Mm,
kind of
the
circuitry
rotation,
from
yeah.
our perspective of Earth. Yeah, exactly. And so there are certain affinities that you see in nature that have these kind of telltale characteristics that tell us what each plant is used for. And so in the
Yeah.
past, they had to rely very much so, especially because Paracelsus said that Galenic medicine and the concept of the four humors was complete nonsense. And that was
Mm,
proven enough by the fact that people were getting sicker instead of actually recovering, utilizing that method. And he has great sense and a lot of great points in his arguments there. So he came up with kind of that doctrine of signature system, but then he also utilized an interesting logic about the dosing of certain plants either being helpful or not as well. And so, for instance, if, like, for instance, he was treating mercury, or sorry, treating syphilis with a preparation of mercury. But the way he
hmm
was treating the mercury was by combining it with sulfur and performing sublimations of it in order to create a mercury sulfide substance. And that same mercury sulfide substance has been used also in Taoist traditions and also in Ayurvedic traditions dating back thousands of years to treat very, very similar types of conditions, especially skin ulcers, boils, etc., which are the first manifestation of syphilis itself. And so he was able to come to that conclusion more or less on his own, and was able to titrate the dosage of this mercury sulfide preparation so that it would be able to eliminate mercury or syphilis. And he was very, very, very successful in doing that. People historically who were adversaries of Paracelsus would say, you can't give somebody mercury. You just told us that mercury was poisonous. And Paracelsus said, well, first of all, it depends on the preparation. Secondly, it depends on the dose, because everything is either a poison or a medicine, all depending on its dose. And so
right.
all of those kinds of things are very important nuances to the spagyric pharmacopoeia in order for a spagyrist to understand. But in general, the way that I was taught, which is kind of part of the late 19th century occult revival kind of interest in alchemical arts, was that you pick 7 herbs that correspond to 7 planets, the traditional 7 planets of the
Mm.
ancients, and you make one item of pharmacopoeia, like one spagyric tincture of each of those, and um, then you take those for an entire year, and then those tend to clear out the
Mm.
subtle energy channels in the body that correspond to those planets, with the same type of philosophy really that Chinese medicine has, just in a different way of looking at it. So Chinese medicine has all these different meridians, and they are known as, say, liver meridian, small intestine meridian, right,
Mm.
lung meridian, etc.
Yeah.
We look at those same things, but we say that the planetary energy exists inside of those organs. So, for instance, Jupiter inside of the lungs, because they expand and they're gaseous, and they
Mm.
move in and out, and all these other things. Mercury for the liver and the small intestine, and these are Paracelsus' own attributions. Sometimes you'll actually hear people talk about Mercury being the respiratory tract in the lungs and
Mm.
Jupiter being the liver, but that didn't happen until over 150 years after Paracelsus' death. Paracelsus himself said that Mercury is over the liver and Jupiter over the lungs. Saturn over the structure of the body, skin, hair, nails, joints, things like that. And that there are these intrinsic, the way Paracelsus kind of defined it was that there are these intrinsic connections between those organs and other kind of spiritualized channels inside of the
Mm.
body. And realistically, if we look at that from a more scientific perspective today, what we're taking a look at are overlapping and intersecting fascial planes that connect to and from these organs with the fascia, which is kind of a liquid crystalline matrix that
Mm.
connects all of the tissues in the body and all of the organs in the body and stuff. So um, that's really kind of the concept behind it, and
Yeah.
it can get a little bit convoluted. But anybody who has any sort of herbalist training and knows like kind of how to approach herbs based on their energetics and based on their physiological properties, like is it a demulcent, or is it a carminative, or any of these other
Mm.
types of qualities, you'd be able to make or identify an item of spagyric pharmacopoeia that is capable of doing the same thing. The only difference is that with Spagyria, we also acknowledge that there's a multidimensional causation to disease and to
Mm.
imbalances in general. And so, for instance, um, if I have a liver problem, but the cause of my liver problem is a neuro-emotional issue, you could give me all the liver medicines in the world that you want, but unless the medicines are designed to approach the limbic brain and dealing with those particular hangups and neuro-emotional conflicts, then there's no amount of physical medicine that you would be able to give the liver that would
Right.
cause it to fully reconstitute. You would always end up being at a debility somewhere. And so
Yeah,
with
it would just wash through and not really obtain or uptake into the system.
exactly, like it'll help the physical level because
Mm.
that's the level that it's addressing. But when the root cause of the problem is, in this case, neuroemotional, exists within the astral, you have to address the astral
I gotcha.
issue. And so that would be one of the benefits of Spagyria and its cosmology in today's world, is that we're always looking to match the remedy to the dimensional causation of
Mm.
the condition or of the symptom.
And this is where astrology will come into play, right? This is where you'll start tying Spagyria and astrology together, or is that am I missing that? Is there a connection between those?
There is, or at least there can be. There
Yeah.
is always. So not only do we philosophize that there's a multidimensional composition to the universe, which is very familiar to anybody in Western esoteric kind of studies. We take a look at the 4 elements of fire, air, water, and earth, and from a
Mm.
Kabbalistic perspective, those also correspond to 4 worlds, Kabbalistic worlds, as we'd refer to them. And these these worlds, for lack of a better term, are also just dimensions, if we want to talk about them like that. So we would talk about, for instance, we have Asaya, Yetira, Baraya, Atzilut in Kabbalah, which are
Mm.
these 4 worlds. In dimensional terminology, we would refer to those as the physical, the astral, the causal, and the spiritual, respectively. And so we have that composition, but then we also have a different causation too. So enzestrale is called the cause of disease due to the stars, or cause of imbalance of the stars.
Mm.
And if a person has, say, an astral body affliction, and the cause is ancestrale, then we have to be able to either make remedies or utilize approaches that balance out that ancestrale in order to revitalize the astral energy centers in the body, which are centered in the organs. Like, for instance, the sun is centered in the heart. That are able to restore the electromagnetic and piezoelectric charges to those fascial planes and to the organs themselves. So astrology can definitely come into play with that. And the way that I have come to practice based on my own experience and my own clinical trials and my own research is significantly different than the way that Paracelsus had talked about things, and also the
Mhm.
way that like Culpeper had talked about, planetary rulership, and the way that it was passed on to me based on the kind of 19th century occult revival style alchemy that exists for most people to learn today. So I have a slightly different take on all of those things based
Yeah,
on my own thing. So
right.
the way that I
It
talk about it and the way that others talk about it might differ.
right. It's like the observer always is going to change the outcome of the experiment, right? It's like
Sure.
we could both be standing there, same thing, and both witness different things. But
Yep.
the
Exactly.
I've heard this idea of like when you're exit your mother's womb and you inhale the spirit for the first time, you're imbued with like some of the energy of the world above, right? Sorry.
Yeah.
And so you inhale and then you're imbued with those. Now that's kind of where a birth chart would come into play. This is all stuff that I've heard. I wanted to clarify, see if this adds up at all to you. And then they'll be like, oh, you're not so good with Pisces and yada yada, right? And then the
Sure.
Pisces is attributed to a certain mineral or cell salt. And I've heard that it could be a deficiency, is what they mean, not like a personality thing, but it's an actual depleted mineral that you may have gotten based on the spirit that you inhaled for your first time.
Sure. Yeah. So there's a number of different ways of taking a look at that. Like, for instance, the cell salts, the biochemical cell salts, or the salts of salvation,
Salts of
they were
salvation.
as they were talked about. I love that term. It's very poetic, if nothing else.
Yeah, you can't
But
forget that.
yeah, exactly. But one of the basic principles around that is that the sun is in a constellation for a certain amount of time, right?
Mhm.
And we are only in the womb for about 10 months. And so what happens is that there are 2 to 3 different constellations that the sun will never move through
Mhm.
during the time that you're in utero, which means that you missed out on that general vital energy of the sun that corresponds to these certain minerals that exist inside of the cell in trace amounts. And so when you're born, you tend to be deficient naturally in those things. Now, that whole book goes into the concepts of tropical astrology and breaks the constellations into 12
Right.
equal constellations all the way around the zodiac. And so it's more of like a direct prescription where, if you were born in the constellation of Leo, then you lack some of Leo, you lack some of Virgo, and you lack some of Libra. And so you
Mhm.
need the cell salts that correspond to those because you were not in utero during those times. Um, cool. That's fine. You can do that. I tried that and I've run clinical trials on that. And that's not exactly the way that it works, or at least my data would not
Right.
show that that is ubiquitously correct. It's not a bad approximation, but it's certainly not ubiquitously correct.
Gotcha.
So that's the concept behind the cell salts. The concept behind astrology and ancestrale in the first place is really this: that when you're born, when you're conceived, of course, your soul starts to develop and your body starts to develop, but you are not taking on your own spirit, which is to say your own breathing, until after you are born and you take your first breath. Until that time, you are very much so dependent upon the electromagnetic field in the breath of your mother in order to keep your entire biological organism alive. But once you take your first breath, your mother can die and you won't die, right? You
Right.
have your own breath. However, if you're in utero and your mother dies, you will die, at least if you're not taken out of the womb in a very, quick surgical procedure. And if you're too young, then I'm sorry, you're toast anyway. But so that is kind of one of those things. And now when you take in your first breath, this is why we do astrology at the time of birth as opposed to at the time of conception. At the time of conception tells us a little bit more about the soul and the body and its development. But the entire person as sulfur, mercury, and salt, or as soul, spirit, and body, they all come together at that moment of your first breath. And when you do that, all of the stars and the electromagnetic energy around us and all of the planets, they are constantly refracting and reflecting light and other, light is just an electromagnetic frequency, but there are causal and spiritual energies being sent as well. And for the most part, all of these things are measurable with sensitive equipment. And what we can do is see that these things tend to influence the human individual. Well, where the planets are at in their relative location to the ecliptic, or what some people would call the zodiac, creates kind of like an astral thumbprint or an astral fingerprint that is unique more or less to you, where all of those planets are at. And at any given time, it's just geometry because, we can plot everything on a kind of a circular chart here. When the sun, if it was over here at the time of your birth, the sun is always moving, so it's not going to stay where it was at the time of your birth, even though that's where it's most comfortable for you. It will end up 90 degrees away from where it was at the time of your birth, and 180 degrees away, and all of these other different aspects. And every different planet has kind of different rules to this. But the basis is that there are antipathic or pathogenic geometric perspectives from where the planet was at the time of your birth to where it's at any given point. We call that a transit. Where it's at in its transit. And that is going to create astral stress on your system because those planets, they correspond to the different organs and the different energy lines, for lack of a better term, meridians within us. And so for astrological medicine, we have to be able to make remedies or talismans or other things that are able to capture the energy of where things were at the time of your birth and be able to administer that to you. And that helps to tonify all of the energy centers and the organs themselves that correspond with those planets. So that is kind of part of the astrology as applied to the Paracelsian concept of ens astrale.
And then because you're practicing, right? You make these medicines, you help people. And what are some of like the ways of diagnosing someone? Is it based around sort of this concept where you would like get their birth chart and that type of stuff first, or is there a different method of diagnosing or figuring out what you think that the patient would be in need of?
Sure. For any governmental bodies listening,
Right.
I
Okay. Yeah,
don't
there you go.
diagnose and I don't have
Yeah.
patients.
Sorry. Yeah. Sorry.
But so yeah, realistically, the way that we would analyze for that, I have come to utilize quantum scalar technology, which we refer to as IDF. But IDF, quantum scalar, radionics, psionics, psychotronics, all of these are terms that are completely synonymous with one another. And there's a bunch of different instruments. Like if I send you to, say, Guitar Center, and say go and pick out an instrument, you might come back with a banjo or a ukulele or a saxophone or drums or a guitar or whatever. Okay, if you were like, hey, I want to learn how to play Stairway to Heaven on the guitar, but you go out and buy drums, you're obviously not going to be able to play Stairway to Heaven on the guitar. It's just like you have to have the right instrument, right? So
Right.
there's definitely that type of dynamic with SE5 or other different types of instrumentation that we can use with doing intrinsic data field or quantum scalar analysis, is that you have to have an instrument that is actually capable of doing what you want to do. And so we utilize the SE5 2000 Gold, which was developed by Dr. Don Paris, and we use it as an intrinsic data field analyzer where I can take tissues or even a digital photograph of the individual and be able to run analysis on the individual from any distance. I mean, they could be in space as far as we care, because we're not dealing with a physical like testing or a bioresonance. We're not dealing with the electromagnetic field. We're literally dealing with causal energy here. We're dealing with things that can vector type of quantum scalar energy. So with that being said, we perform analysis and we find out what the multidimensional causation is of the imbalance or imbalances that the person has come to see us for. And then we also research what the causation is within the Paracelsian framework that we've developed. And of course, I've added on to that. So we now call it the Aurelian framework because it's kind of a continuation of Paracelsian ideas. It would be a misnomer to just call it Paracelsian at this
Yeah.
point. So yeah, that's what we would do is we would find these things out first through that way, and we would analyze for it. And then we have a number of different ways that we could go about balancing it depending on what the found imbalance is. Like for instance, if it is an astrological issue or what we call ancestrale issue, then I could make talismans for the person, but I have to wait until any of those planets come back around to where they were at the time of that person's birth. For the
even the
sun,
talisman to work, right? So even
exactly.
yeah, okay, gotcha.
For the moon, that can be relatively easy, but people don't usually have disease by the moon itself. They have it based on the north and south lunar nodes, and those move a lot more slowly. So it's harder to be able to make a talisman for that. Same thing with the outer lying planets like Jupiter and Saturn and Pluto and Uranus. They move so slowly that to have them come back around to the time of the person's birth is oftentimes unfeasible. So unless somebody is casting uh, talismans during the time you were born for you, it's going to be unlikely that you'll be able to have those talismans. However, we do have the ability to utilize the intrinsic data field technology through what we call balancing broadcasts to be able to send all of that causal information of where the person's planets were at along the ecliptic at the time of their birth to the individual and to be able to erase that. And that tends to be the fastest and most economical and least, path of least resistance really in being able to address those types of things. And ancestrale, because all of the planets are moving, is actually the most common causation of imbalance. It's not always the major causation that causes the symptoms that a person has, but it almost always is cutting down the electrical resistance and electromagnetic and piezoelectric resistance inside of the body and preventing the body from achieving its maximum state of homeostasis or maximum state of wellness.
Yeah. What was it that got you into this? Was it just your own self discovery, trying to get yourself trying to keep yourself whole? You saw there was an issue in the pharmaceuticals. Like, what was it that really spawned this into your nature?
Yeah, well, a lot of that. I mean, from the earliest of times as a kid, I'd be in the bath and pour this, thing and add these nuts to this and, mix things and be out in nature. And it's like crush up some leaves and add some mud and like pretend that here's a potion, or whatever. I think a lot of kids do that, but I was really obsessed with that and always obsessed with like Merlin the Magician and medieval times and, Renaissance era and all sorts of things like that as a kid. But when I was 16, I had dislocated my ankle 3 times in a 90-day period. I used to be a very avid skateboarder and messed myself up really badly. And the doctors were like, "Hey, dude, you got to stop skating like for at least a year or 2." And I was 16 at this point. I knew if I stopped skating at 16, by the time I'm 18, I'm probably not going to have chances to go pro the way that I had wanted. And so I kind of gave up on that dream at that point. I could have pushed through and maybe made it, but I mean, that's a hard life anyway. And I just decided, something else. So I started going into the woods a lot and I'd play my guitar. I'd get stoned, really stoned, to play my guitar in the woods. And I remember sitting there, I was in like this cool little scrub oak grove where I would go at this place called Fernwood. There's like a castle that was like a private residence right at the boundary of this cool installation of Cache National Forest, Wasatch Cache National Forest called Fernwood. And I lived just a skip from there. So I'd go up there all the time and, smoke a bowl, play my guitar. And I was sitting in this little grove and looking around and I noticed that there were all these plants and it just dawned on me, like, I don't know what any of these plants names are, but I know that my Native American ancestors and those who preceded me here, they would have known what all of these things did. They would have known how to use it for rope and how to make fishing line and how to heal themselves and all these other things. And so I ended up just kind of going to the computer lab and learning about herbs and doing this during my free time in school, and ended up getting a document that was from the Philosophers of Nature. Is like a simple PDF called "How to Make a Spagyric Tincture," and it was just a flow chart. All it was just like a diagram that told me how to do it. And so I ended up getting some materials and going out into the woods and kind of cutting my teeth. And it wasn't until years later, actually, that I learned what spagyric meant and that it was actually part of the alchemical tradition. But once I found out and made the conscious connection, like, oh, wow, these things that I'm making are technically part of alchemy, it got
Yeah.
me really excited. And I started getting into Rosicrucian work
Mm.
and started like meeting a lot of the students of Frater Albertus from the Paracelsus Research Society, which was the largest alchemical school in the world that was right here in my home state in Utah, from 1960 to 1984. I wasn't born until 86, so the school wasn't around anymore, but a lot of the students were. And a
Mm.
lot of the education was, and Frater Albertus had books published. And in 2007, it was a couple of years after I graduated high school. In 2007, there was the first International Alchemy Conference, and it was held in Las Vegas. And they had another one in 2008, and then in 2009 it moved to Los Angeles. And I just attended all of these events and met a lot of people, and that really nourished um, a huge a huge capacity for me to learn. Like they were constantly, citing different books and texts and talking about things in a very open way that otherwise was at that time in particular was not available. And this was the early days
Mm.
of Yahoo forums, and so I was getting onto that and learning more. And I never studied with any one teacher. I have tons of resources that I drew from, and I started learning. But of course, most of the surviving work was from Paracelsus Research Society, from a guy named Frater Albertus and his surviving students, and a guy named Jean Dubuis from France, who was part of the Kabbalistic Order of the Rosy Cross and taught the Philosophe de la Nature, PDN, in France, and then they had an American organization. So I went through all of that coursework, which were virtually identical. The approach of Frater Albertus and the approach of Jean Dubuis were almost identical. And so I went through that entire initiation, that entire process, and then further went into some of the Rosicrucian work and other things like that. And I got interested in it. But eventually, everybody in alchemy quotes Paracelsus when it's convenient for them, but they don't have his entire cosmology or philosophy even remotely nailed down. And
Mm.
unfortunately, from my perspective, what a lot of people do is they will read about a process that they think is one process, and they draw from like 5 or 6 different authors, like Trithemius, or from Paracelsus, or from Raymond Lilly, or whatever, and they think that it's all one process, and they're constantly like, coming up with some sort of synthetic process that they've come up with based on all these inspirations. So you'll find quotes all the time from Paracelsus, but not many people really knew what he was all about. So I decided to make it my mission to really learn about it. And when I dove into his works, especially his medical works, I was like, wow, this guy is so far ahead, even of our
Mm.
own time. But for the 1500s, he was way ahead. He was like 1,000 years or more ahead of his time for sure. And it just fascinated me. And I started really getting into it. And then after about 5 years of studying his work, I was like, I want to flesh out some of these ideas. And so I started coming up with research studies that I would be able to do with clients to test out various different ideas or parts of the cosmology that I could conceivably think about. How can I prove that or disprove that? How can I come up with an experiment that gives me some sort of data to draw upon? So that I know whether this is real or whether it's just blowing smoke up my ass.
Yeah.
And so I started taking a look at doing those things. And in 2014, I think it was, I put together my first one, which was all about the astrological causations of disease. And ever since then, I've just been nonstop. That's been like 10 years ago now that I've been running clinical trials on people in one way or the
Mhm.
other with live subjects and being able to flesh out the cosmology and being able to find what works and what doesn't,
Yeah.
and adapting it kind of, I guess, to my own style as well. So
Right. That's awesome. Yeah. I was just thinking all of a sudden, when you brought up back when you were younger, I can remember being around 16 and finding the anarchist cookbook.
yeah,
And
totally, man.
yeah, and then like by 17 extracting THC with alcohol
Yep.
and then figuring out that butane works much better. But yeah, so it's been something I was always entertained with as a younger man, and still entertains me now with my activities at night and such. But I definitely find this intriguing. Like all of it seems to be just more or less people separating the philosophical end of the science. It's like they continue to do that today, but it does seem like some of the science of mind, they're getting back into the philosophical thoughts and approaches. There's people
Undoubtedly.
out there, yeah. And so it seems to be as though we are coming back around to this idea that there's a little bit more than just material.
Yeah, well, and we're kind of in a prime time. I mean, even yeah, I think it was like in the late 1980s, a lot of physicians and medical researchers who were publishing peer-reviewed documents were starting to state that about 90 to 95% of the causation of all disease is psychosomatic in origin, meaning that it has some sort of origination with thoughts and emotions.
Right.
And even that to me is like a very limited statement. But, they started saying that, but they're still trying to manipulate the physical chemicals and hormones
That are
and
going on.
yeah, they're approaching it from a very Newtonian perspective of
Yeah.
biomechanics instead
Yeah.
of taking a look at it from more of the psychomechanic level or a neuro-emotional level.
Yeah.
And
It's
you
like
know,
Dr. Joe Dispenza. He has You Are the Placebo, and that book is fantastic. I don't know if you,
yeah,
yeah, I totally infatuated with that, and just the ideas that you, just the, yeah, concepts, and it's profound.
yeah, I think it is, man. I think a lot of people are coming back around to this, and the fact that there's so much quote unquote medicine community resurgence. Sometimes those are really just an excuse for people to do more drugs, but
Yeah.
authentically, people do have breakthrough experiences under
Mm.
the effects of psychedelics if they're ready
Yeah.
for them and guided properly. Most of the people that I see guiding these ceremonies are capable of holding space, but they're not capable of actually doing the work that is necessary to get the person to look at their own darkest shit because they're
Yeah.
oftentimes too inebriated. They're not familiar enough actually with the medicine before they take it on. And
Mm.
unfortunately, they sat with a shitty shaman who was just taking their money too
Money.
from
Yeah.
South America or whatever. And so
Right.
they were like, oh, well, I can do this. And it's conflated and it's become a
Yeah.
bad issue. But a real authentic shaman should be able to know consciousness and the substance that he or she uses
Mm.
to such an intimate degree that he or she can guide both the individual or the neophyte as well as be able to channel the energy of the medicine enough
Right.
to help that person to heal and to move through things. That would
Yeah.
be an authentic experience. And a
Yeah.
lot of people are having completely mind opening and life altering experiences utilizing psychedelics and psychedelic assisted therapy. So it's not all bad, it's not all good, but it does need a better integration if we want it to work with precision the way that I know that it's capable of doing. And for me, there are many different cosmologies and many different styles that can work and do work. But for me, the one that I resonate with the most and that I can hold the space for, of course, is that Spagyric or kind of modern alchemical philosophy and cosmology, because
Yeah.
it gives us a framework for how to be able to do that work and see what the hangups of the individual might be. And yeah, we have great success being able to
Yeah.
do that.
What kind of advice would you give someone that was looking into wanting to, say, buy your little setup in the back and get started on something like this? Would it be to start working on the self and their mental space, their psychology before they got into making any type of medicine?
Yeah, absolutely. My approach that I teach, which to distinguish it from other different schools of thought that are around, we started calling everything after my last name. And so it's like the Aurelian approach,
Aurelius, yeah.
Aurelian alchemy, Aurelian Spagyria,
Yeah.
Aurelian medicine, all of that type of shit. So with that being said, within the approach that I teach people is that if you want to be a good spagyrist, you have to be an alchemist first. You have to
Mm,
go through the alchemical processes of your own transformation, which is just like saying that a shaman actually has to do his or her own work with the medicine alone in order to understand what is going on and achieve those breakthrough states
mm-hmm.
before they would be able to actually guide another person through it. It's no different. In fact, alchemy has oftentimes been talked about as a shamanic practice of medieval West, or at least, Western alchemy, the way that we talk about it today's kind
Yeah.
of context. So I do suggest that, and there are a number of different resources that can give a person a decent handle and decent cosmology on all of that. I teach a class called Transpersonal Alchemy that kind of lays out what the psychological and spiritual processes are that correspond to each of the physical laboratory processes that you're going through. And I
Mm-hmm.
tell people that it would probably be best to start out there, and then move into lab work and then approach the work with the awareness that everything that you do to this plant, you are actually doing to one aspect of yourself. Just like there are
Yeah.
millions of plants out there, each of those plants kind of corresponds to a different psychological, spiritual, and or physical component of yourself. And so
Yeah.
when you're working on the plant, you're actually working on yourself. And if you do the work with that state of awareness and that state of attention, the quantum state of observation kicks in, where you realize that the observer is actually altering the experiment, and
Right.
the herb is observing you and you are observing the herb, and
Mm-hmm.
there is this dynamic relay of consciousness that is able to work on the individual. And so I think that people should really start there, but only do it realistically if you're called to a very, very intense path,
Mm,
because there's a lot of cost involved in
right.
even just buying some of the types of
Yeah.
equipment that we use. There's a ton of time involved. It's a lot of time spent with natural elements and doing things in a very slow and contemplative way. It's much like a Taoist practice is.
Yeah.
It takes a lot of time to like really get all of the procedures and everything and just the physical mechanics down enough to where then you can really be aware of the more subtle aspects that are happening during those physical dynamics, to the point where then you can use your mind and breath to channel the energy once you're aware of those dynamics. So there's always kind of like those three levels.
Yeah.
So alchemy isn't maybe necessarily for everybody,
Right.
but for those that it is good for, or for those that have a sincere calling to this path, there's an abundance of resources available today that will help you kind of find your style and determine how you want to go about performing your work. But yes, before, just like you should definitely study with a shaman and do your own work probably for 10 to 15 years, minimally 20 years probably,
Mm,
before you ever take on another client. If you want to be ethical and really know your shit when you're working with people,
right.
it's the same thing in the spagyric laboratory. You need to know not only how to make medicines, but also what they do and how they interact on you, and how you like all of the different ins and outs of it before you
Yeah.
start making medicines for other people. It's just
Right.
at that point, it's really kind of an ethics issue.
Right. Well, I'm gonna put a link towards your podcast and your website, everything else in between on the description. So if anybody's interested in going to check out that class that he was bringing up, make sure you go and hit the link and then get into that and get into yourself into something new instead of chasing the mundane. Go and find something that'll actually bring you up and uplift you, burn you up into the phoenix that you are.
For
But
real. Well,
I
thanks for
think
that.
yeah, no, I appreciate you taking your time out of the day to come and talk to me. I know I don't have that big of a following or anything, but everyone starts somewhere. So I do appreciate it. This is going to be invaluable to anybody that listens to it. And I hope that it drives someone to do something bigger for themselves.
Man, yeah, well, I'm certain that it will, and you are a great interviewer. I'm not inexperienced with interviews, and
Yeah.
you've got a great flow, and you do a
Oh,
great job. So
I
I'm really
appreciate it.
stoked, man. I hope that
Yeah,
this is not just the start of something that fizzles out, but rather the start of something that you continue doing, because you really have a talent for this.
I appreciate that, Phoenix. Yeah, I really do appreciate it. Well, yeah, you never know. You got self-doubt all the time, right? So I just keep emailing people and hope they respond. But I will definitely try and get in contact with you again if I could figure out another conversation.
Yeah, absolutely, man. I mean, there's tons of stuff we can talk about. So,
Right.
whenever you're ready, you just reach out, man.
All right. Well, thank you, Phoenix. And like I said, I will be putting all that information there in the description. My computer's going crazy, but I appreciate your time and we'll talk again.
Awesome. Thank you so much, James.
Good
Blessings.
deal. Blessings.